It's hard already, 'cause I don't know when we'll be near again. I'm tired already, even though all I've done is stay in. I hear your voice on the phone, and I even see your face, but it's not enough. I long just to feel your embrace. Although I know I can't sleep through the night. I've cried already, I miss you so, and I know you'd hold me tight. My fear would fade from my eyes, and I'd melt into your arms. If you were here, I know that you would keep me from harm. I wish that I'd found you before, when I had the chance. I should have made time, I should have called. That I'd seen you, that we'd stayed in touch. Maybe right now I'd be right at your side. I feel so threatened, I'm wondering if I will see you again. It's been unsettling, I just don't know if this will ever end. I'll just keep dreaming of when I see you, of when I hold your hand. I'll tell you so you'll understand. I'm thinking of you. Hope you feel my love that shines for you. I'm dreaming of you, the times we shared. If I could, I'd follow you anywhere. I know I can't be there with you, but stay on the line a while. I'll sing you to sleep. Maybe I'll make you smile. Go to sleep, don't you fret. Don't wake up in a sweat. Though it seems things are bad, it's not time for us yet. Where did you want to go before it all fell down? Let's go there, let's dream now, and we'll get you there somehow.
So I think I met you, Erica Del Bassa, soprano sfogato. I think I met you on Facebook initially, and you had shared an album with some like microtonal, like drone, sort of like drone, like songwritery pieces that were really cool. What was that called again? Love and Distance?
I think that's right. Yeah, that's my first album, and it's a kind of a grab bag. It's pretty eclectic. All of the pieces are written not in 12 EDO, but although one or two of the pieces are kind of 12 EDO adjacent, but using just in tone intervals, and It really is, like you said, it's like some singer-songwritery kind of stuff. Like 3 tracks are like kind of singer-songwritery kind of stuff. There's a couple of like narrative storytelling tracks with musical accompaniment. And then the rest of the stuff is all pretty like out there and experimental. Some of it is explicitly like microtonal composition, and some of it is kind of has music that's arising from places that aren't even necessarily like based on a scale system. So, for example, one of the pieces, Dragonspawn in Space, it's a genre that I've heard referred to as bytebeat, but it's basically like a melody that arises from like integer arithmetic. And so if I think about like, well, okay, what kind of scale system is it in? It's using basically the harmonic series, because it ends up having a bunch of relationships that arise out of like integer ratios. But I wasn't thinking about like, what kind of just-in-tone scale is this, or what kind of intervals are available or whatever. I was just writing math equations and seeing what came out of it.
Huh. So what was your workflow like for that particular song? Because I don't think I'm grasping the concept of writing all of this without a scale, but then finding out it's the harmonic series later.
Yeah, so that's actually, it's a really, it's a fascinating area of music, and if you look up like bytebeat or short algorithmic composition or something along those lines, you'll find all these people who are making these crazy little songs. And basically how it works is it's, instead of even thinking about different music notes, or, kind of arranging or sequencing music notes, it's basically a math function that describes the signal in the output at any given like little timestamp, where we're thinking about like individual samples. So we're not thinking about like notes, what note is playing at this time. We're thinking about like what sample value is playing, the very first sample, and then the second sample, and then the third sample, and so forth, at like 8,000 samples per second or something along those lines.
What?
And you write these little, it's really crazy. Oh yeah, okay, so let me go to Reddit, because I made a Reddit post on the bytebeat subreddit about this song, and that really probably explains it the best. And it'll be easy to find because I've made about like 3 Reddit posts ever on this account. Okay. My one published bytebeat track, Dragonspawn in Space. So it's a composition that arises from an equation that's like this crazy looking equation. I'll just send it to you in chat so I can get your reaction.
To the equation. Okay, I can't wait to see it.
But then I'll read it off.
Oh my god. T times, parenthesis, 15, greater than? Is that 2 greater thans?
Yeah, so it is 2 greater than symbols, but this is kind of like it's kind of derived from like the C programming language, and it's a bit shift operation. So it's the value 15 shifted to the right by the number of bits that follows that. So shifted to the right by T, shifted by the right by A, where A is a parameter. It's like it's hard to even read this equation off. But basically, it's manipulating integers. So it's taking like the value 15 and it's like moving those bits, off to the right by some number of values, which results in like this smaller value. But then it's moving them back to the left by some number of bits, and then it's it's taking that result and it's doing a XOR, an exclusive OR operation with the current timestamp value, and then it's taking that result and it's shifting it by a further amount. I mean, actually, it's like you can kind of think of this whole thing as being like the current timestamp value shifted by a certain amount, exclusive ORed with the current timestamp value shifted by a different certain amount that's dependent on the current timestamp value, and then multiplied by the current timestamp value shifted by 2 other different amounts and ANDed together. It's just like, it's a very, kind of incomprehensible equation, but it's basically just like twiddling numbers around. It's just taking like bits and moving them around. And the cool thing is that the song has some like additional processing and some additional kind of aesthetic decisions, but if I take just this equation, there are people who have made these tools online that can play these equations out.
Oh, whoa, that's really neat.
Here's a link to one. So here, you can play this.
Okay. Hey, click on this and see what happens.
And this is just like the raw equation, and this melody arises from this equation, where basically like the value of the speaker or the sample is continuously shifting based on the result of this equation at each subsequent timestamp.
That is unfathomably cool, especially with the
crazy?
visual.
I know, yeah, that visual's so cool, and it's the crazy thing about it to me is that like that's not sequenced music. That equation isn't describing like what note to play at any given time. It's not describing what frequency to play at any given time. It is describing like the raw values of the waveform. So that what sounds like a song to me has this kind of rhythmic and melodic character is just a waveform. So it's almost like that song is the output of some particular synth or some particular, wave equation. And anyway, so to turn it into a full song, I ended up just kind of like parameterizing it so that like the equation changes a little bit over time, with just like an envelope in automation in my DAW. And then like, throwing a bunch of effects on it, reverb, grain delay, and this really great VST plugin that I recommend every experimental musician play with called Riviera, that is just like a crazy reverb it's like 5-dimensional reverb. So it has like, a reverb in a 5-dimensional space, and you can play with the reverb in the different dimensions independently. But anyway, so then if I put all of that together, it ends up having this kind of crazy sound along with this kind of ambience, and it's like, how did I come up with the melody? I mean, trial and error, basically. I played with different versions of this equation, and if you pull up one of these equations, it's really fun because you can just like tweak stuff. You can just like, okay, well, what if I multiplied that by 2? What if I bit shifted that by a different value? What if I, multiplied it by the time value again? And you get all of these crazy results.
It seems like it's produces a lot of these like periodic sounds that aren't exactly easy to diagnose, which I think is a really, like, I've heard that as a common trope in like acousmatic pieces, so it's really exciting.
I'm not familiar with acousmatic. What's that?
That just means that the speakers themselves playing the music, like in a concert hall, is kind of considered the performance instrument, and generally,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, and generally...
There's no other way you could play this. There's
right.
No other way that you could come up with this music. Yeah, so totally.
If fixed media is the idea that there is no performance element and the sound is just played back, acousmatic music is music where you don't know what's making the sound. So those two concepts are highly tied up in each other and are very common at at universities where there are electronic music concerts. Like, I've heard a lot of these kinds of sounds in those concerts, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, there's no other way you could produce this kind of sound. The only thing that you could perform is, like, choosing different parameters as you play it back, because it's basically like a synth that produces this waveform and this kind of melody and rhythm. And it's actually, you asked about, like, how one would write something like this. This song is, like, the earliest song I wrote on that album, because I was playing with these things like years ago, and then when I was putting the album together, I was like, I gotta do something with this. So I like dug up an old email where I had this like equation pasted in, and then I tweaked it a little bit. But it is so cool to me because there is no there's no scale, there's no there's no meter, there's no rhythmic system or anything. Those things all just sort of arise out of the waveform playing, but at the same time, it clearly has harmony and rhythm to it, and it these waveforms, when you play them back, they're kind of like this almost infinitely variable thing. You'll be listening to it and it'll play back and it'll start getting to where it's almost like in a loop, but it'll have these little tiny subtle variations. And you'll be asking yourself, have I heard that version of the loop before, or is it different now?
Right. Yeah.
It's not exactly microtonal, but at the same time it kind of is, because it has these relationships that are derived from, if anything, the harmonic series. So they're not 12 EDO. Some of the intervals are going to be smaller. Most of them are going to be bigger because it has kind of a lot of low harmonics in it. And, but I would definitely say that it falls under the kind of the bigger blanket label of Xen harmonic, because it's not what people expect when they're hearing music.
So do you usually write music wanting to be Xen harmonic, or sometimes not? Or how do you usually approach that in your songwriting or in your more experimental music?
I think I'm kind of agnostic to it, but I also don't want to privilege 12 EDO.
Right.
You know, I am kind of. It's funny because the music that I've published so far is really all pretty experimental, with like a couple of sort of singer-songwritery things. But I really got into it because I wanted to do more like singer-songwritery stuff, and also choral arrangement and composition. And then COVID happened, so I wasn't with choirs performing, so I needed to find some kind of musical outlet, and so I started doing solo stuff. And a lot of it is kind of like, a lot of the stuff that I'm writing is like singer-songwritery kind of stuff, but then I don't end up necessarily finishing all of those songs on the pace that I would maybe like to, because of just all the kind of perfectionism that goes into trying to express, you know, a song that I've written, and wanting to sing it really well and wanting to produce a track really well. And I end up making these like experimental kind of like noise sound experiments instead. And, you know, and then those I end up feeling really happy with. So I'm like, I might as well just publish this. As far as like my approach to like Xen or Xen harmonic sounds, I'm not like setting out like, oh, this has to sound weird, this has to be different. I'm mostly just kind of like, I don't want to limit myself to one system of composition. I don't want to limit myself to like 12 EDO. And when I start playing around with something that like has a different scale system or that has no scale system, I end up really liking the results, so I end up going with it. A lot of the stuff though that I write is like not actually particularly weird as in harmonic music goes. You know, a lot of it is like I'm working within some microtonal scale system and then mostly doing pretty friendly intervals. At the same time, I really like that I can find the kind of unfriendlier intervals when I need them. The title track of my album, Love and Distance, I tried to make it fairly friendly, but in an earlier version of the track, the chorus portion, I kind of had this intent to like make the listener uncomfortable, and I had this this chord that was kind of just like almost it was all done through synthesis, but almost like, you know, guitar strumming kind of an effect. That's just kind of like this repetitive chord, and I had it microtonally shifting up and down, and a lot of people I showed it to really liked it, and one particular person I showed it to said, "Oh my god, I could not listen to that. It made me nauseated. It made me feel like I was going to throw up. It gave me a headache." And I was thinking, on the one hand, like, I want to change that because I don't want to give anyone a headache while they're listening to my music, but on the other hand, how cool and how powerful is that to think, you know, that there's this, that you can use harmony to actually make someone sick. I mean, not that that, you know, is ever my goal as a musician, but it's like, I don't know how to do that in 12 EDO.
Right. I don't think you really can do it in 12 EDO without some cheating. I don't think I can get sick listening to harmony. I guess you have to like.
I don't think I can either. And for me, I hear the weird stuff and I'm like, oh, I love that. But
me too. I fall in love with the weird stuff right away. Did you get started with microtonality through the whole bytebeat idea, where you're like generating the samples themselves with code, or were you interested in it earlier than that?
So this is a fun question for me because I was interested in microtonality like way before I had any idea how to explore it. I was interested in microtonality as like a little kid, just because I was like kind of a weird little nerd, and I thought, oh, there's this interesting way of making music that other people don't tend to do very often, and I want to be weird, and I want to do the weird thing that other people don't tend to do. But when I was like, probably like 10 or something, I remember installing Scala on my computer and like trying to use it and like, you know, how can I make microtonal music? How can I like make a scale file? What can I do with it? And being totally lost, like to the point that I just like dropped that endeavor and I like, you know, didn't end up using it at all. So as far as like kind of other microtonal music experiences I've had, I mostly did music in 12 EDO from that point on. I did do a lot of like jazz combo music in high school and a little bit in college, and I remember being really into like certain things that I couldn't explain within 12 EDO. So I played upright bass, and I had this bass teacher who, it was actually, you know, in retrospect, he was just trying to get me to do just intonation, because he would always tell me, don't tune your instrument to the piano, don't listen to the piano. The piano is going to be wrong when you're playing in a jazz combo. Ignore the piano and tune the notes you play according to listening to beats basically between strings. You know, when you're tuning your instrument or when you're tuning to a different instrument, listen for things to like line up. And like he was trying to get me to play like, you know, perfect just and toned fifths and stuff instead of like listening to the piano and having everything be based on 12 EDO. And I remember that there were like these intervals that I would play that, you know, turns out they were like kind of off by like a quarter tone or something like that I really liked, that would be like, oh, you know, there's certain contexts when I want to play like a slightly sharp major third, or when I want to play like a slightly flat major or slightly flat minor third, or, you know, things like that. And I didn't really have any language to describe them, and I kind of just ignored it. And then in college, I started studying music, but I really didn't, I wasn't a hard enough worker for a music program in college, so I ended up going into biology and computer science instead. And kind of, you know, never really learned a whole lot about composition or about like modern music theory or anything like that. Then really only recently I got back into microtonal music. I was doing like choral singing and choral arranging, and then you know, still not really thinking about microtonal or just intoned or Xen harmony or anything like that. Although actually I had this kind of almost premonition kind of experience, because I was working on a choral arrangement, and I was like, this seventh doesn't sound good here. But if I tune it down by like about a quarter tone, it starts to sound really good. And it's like I was finding a harmonic seventh without realizing what I was doing. You know, in a choral arrangement, which makes sense because it's probably how we would have sung it. But I was sitting there like, you know, playing with my piano and like, I don't like this seventh, but if I tune it down just a little bit when I sing it, it sounds so good. So anyway, but I still wasn't thinking like microtonal at that point. What actually ended up happening is I was interested in voice teaching, and I had a number of people ask me if I taught voice lessons, and I was like, no, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to teach voice lessons, which actually has changed because I ended up finding Zia Erose's community for voice instruction, trans voice lessons, and learning a lot about voice through talking to her and other voice instructors, and also learning more about music production and microtonal music. You know, to some extent, it was just kind of like, as soon as I was in a community where at least one other person was doing that, I started like feeling a little bit more encouraged to actually explore it. And so I was like trying to learn about music production, and at the same time I saw that Zia was putting out this like microtonal music, and I was like, well, why don't I learn about microtonal music at the same time? I didn't like know how to use a DAW. So this was back in like February or so. And so I was like, you know, okay, I'm going to learn how to use a DAW. You know, what do I need to do to play microtonal music through a DAW? What kind of synths will support it? You know, how can I do that? And so I kind of just, it was kind of just my approach to making music was like, well, I might as well be open to this possibility of making microtonal music, especially since like I'm at home, stuck inside like everyone is with the coronavirus. And, you know, I wasn't worried about like, what kind of live performers can perform this? You know, what kind of instruments do I need? I was like, I'm making electronic music, so I might as well not limit myself.
Do you think your focus shifted after the coronavirus so that you wanted to make more electronic music, or was that sort of the avenue you were heading down already? It's so nice that, you know, Zia offers, like, those voice lessons as well as production and microtonal advice, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, so I've never actually taken a voice lesson with her, but the community she's built is, she's an amazing teacher, and the community she's built is like, I have got to say, like from what I've seen, like a premier avenue to learn about the mechanics of the voice. Regardless of whether you are interested in transgender, voice gender modification. So I'm trans, and I've modified my voice quite a lot. I haven't changed it a ton since when I joined her community, but I have learned a lot more about voice instruction and about how other people change their voices. Zia has this perspective on sound and harmony that is just like, at the same time, so sophisticated and also so simple. Sound is something that we can all appreciate, and we can appreciate all kinds of different sounds in some of the same ways. It's really interesting to, like, one of the observations that I saw her making when I first joined the community was that the sounds we make with our voices, particularly like the different vowel sounds we can make, are just-intoned harmonies. They're these subsets of the harmonic series, and any vowel sound we make is like, a harmonic series that's been kind of carved out to emphasize some of the harmonics over others. And so it's a really beautiful perspective. My vocal range is like one of the most empowering things to me as a trans woman and as a non-binary person. I can speak around here. I can drop my voice down here to maybe a more typical cliche podcaster voice if I want to.
Yes, the cliche podcast.
And I can do all this, I can do all this kind of crazy stuff. So like one of the things I've been cultivating in the last few months is this is various kinds of polyphonic or dipophonic sounds I can make with my voice. So I can start speaking like this with multiple tones at the same time. It's something I'm not really fully sure how to use in my music yet, but I'm sure it'll show up at some point. It's like, I don't know where else I would go to understand these things.
Thriving community, yeah.
Thriving community for sure. Hundreds of people.
Yeah. There's just so many there.
And you're there too.
Yeah, I'm so glad I joined it. It's one of my favorite things to look at in Discord is all the conversation that happens around it. And I'm trying to kind of like put the whole picture together myself, because of course I'm not as interested in modification for like gender identification purposes, but I'm very interested in seeing like what my voice can do and where my voice can go, and trying, I guess, extended techniques in the voice, which I don't think is really routinely taught.
It's
at
not.
Many universities. And you and I have talked about a little bit of this before. It's like a lot of the ways that we learn to sing at most Western universities, understandably, come from traditional techniques that, are very singular once you learn how many things can be done. Like the thing that you were demonstrating with your voice going up and down with two different pitches simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the kind of sounds like nobody teaches that because it doesn't fit into the classical aesthetic, and it was never used in opera or choral singing or anything like that. But it's like, it's such an interesting technique, and I don't know where I would learn more about it, to be honest. Although actually, so we've talked about different kinds of polyphonic singing. There's also, of course, the people are often more familiar with like Tuvan or Tibetan throat singing, and I have some exciting news about that. I actually tracked down a teacher in Tuva to learn Tuvan throat singing. So I'm going to, probably in January or so, start taking Tuvan throat singing lessons and, like, try to piece together how it works mechanically so I can explain it to other people. Because, I can already kind of approximate those sounds. You have your kind of a, that super droney bassy, and you have the polyphonic, the overtone. Kind of
wow.
sounds. But, I don't really know how to do it in a way that's, like, consistent with the tradition and the way that it's done in the places where we're familiar with those sounds coming from. I just sort of have reverse engineered it or whatever. So I'm really excited about that, because absolutely there are so many techniques of the voice that are, like, not taught. I mean, that actually connects to the transgender voice modification aspect as well, because classical singers and also a lot of voice pedagogues and speech-language pathologists and so forth have these ideas about how the voice should be used that often preclude the ways that people might want to use it. So there's this idea that's really persistent in a lot of areas of voice education that you should never manipulate the exact arrangement of the structures in your throat. You should never manipulate the position of your larynx, for example. But then it turns out that manipulating structures in your throat is critical if you want to modify your voice to accomplish different gender characteristics. And it's also critical if you want to access these different really interesting sounds that are not part of the Western classical tradition or European music. And it's actually, turns out that you have to manipulate the structures of your throat to sing European classical music too. It's just we kind of often tend to ignore that fact and kind of assume that everything is, just being done in the most natural way or something like that, which is not really true. People's natural behaviors are, really drawn from how they've been educated and how they've interacted with other people. But yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and of course on Zia's forum you also have a technical description of the parts of the voice that can relate to what you're hearing, and that, I think, is very helpful in a scientific way. Lots of times
it really is.
In the classroom when you're taught to sing, because that terminology is so difficult, and or the person teaching it might not know about it in the exact same way that we would, calling things resonators R1 and R2, they have to use sort of descriptions of how to get people to be loose with their instrument and how to get them into the right sort of headspace, and that's a lot of what I do at my job. But I'm very interested in the technical language aspect of it and how one can change their R1 and R2 and all of the various other moving parts. You can do crazy voice things and then describe how parts of your various folds moved and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So.
As you start listening to these different characteristics of the voice and you start thinking about how they have different effects, you start to hear them. So you start to hear, one of the examples I like a lot is there's this quality called tongue root retraction, and it's or tongue root engagement, and it's often kind of scorned. It's basically the Kermit the Frog sound. So this kind of a sound to my voice if I bring on this kind of goofy Kermit the Frog cartoon kind of sound. But the interesting thing is once you start listening for it and once you know what's going on with it, you'll start hearing it in classical music. You'll start hearing it in pop singers. You'll start hearing it in people's default speaking voices, just not to the full extent that you'd hear it from a cartoon character. So it's really, really fascinating. And I love the approach of just thinking about the mechanics and trying to have a common vocabulary for what's happening mechanically. And the only places I've really seen that done extensively are in trans voice lessons and in the Estil voice system, which also has this kind of goal of having common language and a common framework for being able to teach people more effectively, and also if they have that common framework, being able to maybe direct them or specify things more effectively. Being able to say, hey, the sound I want here can actually be really precisely described. I want you to, I want this sound to have a higher R1, or I want this sound to have, a lower R2, or whatever. Or I want this sound to have tongue root retraction, or, I want this sound to have heavier vocal folds. And we often leave those out, and we kind of, like you said, we're kind of trying to get people to be free with it, and we end up having these kind of aesthetic descriptors that everyone interprets differently. And so there ends up being a lot of kind of, back and forth to figure out what we mean. There's a thing that's people will talk about all over in the voice, which is forward resonance. People will say, bring the sound forward, feel the sound at the front of your face or something, and it's so ambiguous, and it probably refers to about 5 different things. And so anytime someone brings it up, and if they're a choir director or a speech instructor or whatever, they'll be like, okay, I want the sound to be forward, but not like that, more like this. No, not that other thing. And it's takes all of this trial and error when we could just be describing things more precisely. We could just be describing, what we actually want out of the shape of the lips and the tongue and the structures in the larynx and the throat, and, what muscles should be engaged and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like sometimes those precise descriptors can work if the choir director in question is like describing the face. But then if you're describing like the inside and those technical terms, I think that's so much harder. But I guess it could be really useful if people could get to that level. Maybe it's about getting kids to learn to project, because I know that like with the choirs that I work with, a lot of the kids just like sing into their music. We can't have that.
Yeah.
We need them.
No. Right. Earlier you were asking, like, did we meet over Facebook? And I think we did, because I was showing music on Facebook. But the funny thing is, shortly after that, you ended up on Trans Voice Lessons. So we've ended up talking on Discord and on there, and, you know, sharing music and talking about harmony and stuff like that. So it's kind of a small world, I guess, once you get into this stuff. You also asked a question about whether kind of I had gravitated towards electronic music or whether that was kind of my intent. And I think, you know, I like making electronic music a lot. It's really fun. It's mostly was my intent just in that, like, it was the way to make music, because I didn't have access to other performers. I didn't have access to maybe all the instruments I would want to use, much less the knowledge and skill to play them. But, you know, I did have kind of the ideas in my head that I could get out with electronic music.
Yeah, absolutely. I think making some electronic music, like this kind of has worked for me, is if you're first starting out with microtonal music and you make a little bit of electronic music, it's almost like proof that you can make something, so that if you want to collaborate with people later, you have something to show them, I suppose.
You know, I haven't really thought a ton about, like, performability of the microtonal music I make, and part of it for me is that the fact that it's microtonal isn't really the most important thing. I think that there's so many different ways to possibly implement any given piece, and that I could accomplish the harmonies I want. You know, if I needed to, I could accomplish the harmonies I want in 12 EDO and maybe say, hey, this note has to be detuned a little bit. This is a blue note. This note has to be a little bit flat. Or if I was singing with a choir, I could probably write it out in 12 EDO and just, you know, ask the director to try and shape the sound a specific way. You know, try and, and this actually gets back into that kind of that vague language that we have to use when we're talking to singers. But, you know, oh, we want a really dark sound here. We want a really cold sound here. You know, all these descriptors that were maybe what was going on in my head when I was coming up with a certain microtonal chord or whatever. So I've never really been too super concerned about, like, how can this be performed? You know, does this need to be on violins and a 19 Edo guitar, or, you know, does this have to be played with, you know, voices or whatever? I've really just kind of thought more about, like, the storytelling that I want to accomplish with the song and the moods I want to evoke. And I kind of figure that if the pieces are ever performed, you know, there's a lot of different ways they could be done. Something like Dragonspawn in Space probably has to be fixed media, because I can't really envision any way of performing it exactly as it's written.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder...
approximate it, but...
Like, since it's a code, I know that I've seen performances of live coding.
Yeah, you could certainly do something like that.
So did you say that you were planning to write some more choral music using some more kind of extended techniques with the voice?
You know, so I was, and I had this this plan. months ago, before COVID, I had this plan of, and this is actually gets back to why I joined Zia's community. I had this plan of writing choral music that would be more accommodating to people who don't have like a European singing tradition background, and to people who don't, transgender people, non-binary people, people who have maybe damaged voices or who have non-traditional sounding voices.
Well, that's a good idea.
People who might not feel comfortable fitting into like the standard choral framework. You know, the standard choral framework is very gendered, and it assumes a lot about kind of the development a person has gone through. So we have soprano, alto, tenor, bass. You know, you kind of have to fit everyone into one of those categories, and then what they sing ends up being, you know, kind of based on what part they have. And so I had this idea of like, well, what if we tried other stuff? What if we tried one section of the choir is growling, and one section of the choir is singing like with a really flute-like timbre, and one section of the choir is singing with a really heavy brassy timbre, and one section of the choir is making percussive noises, you know, consonants and plosives and whatnot. And I was pursuing a grant to do that, and then COVID happened, and the grant that I was pursuing just got canceled, so nobody got it. Yeah. So, right, it's so frustrating. But I had this kind of plan of trying to pursue music like that. And actually, I had some compositions that I was sort of working on, but a big part of the plan was to, like, use the grant to commission other composers and to get, you know, people who already have experience with composing more traditional choral music to try this kind of different approach out. And so it didn't end up happening, and because I haven't been able to really sing, you know, in a live choir at all, since COVID started, I haven't really felt super inspired to be working on choral arrangements of any kind. So I've kind of ended up gravitating more towards just making music by myself, which tends to be, you know, either kind of singer-songwriter stuff or kind of noisy experimental stuff. And I guess those are just kind of the directions I feel myself pulled in.
Oh, yeah.
It's an idea I'd love to return to sometime. Because I do think there's all this really cool music we see, again, like outside of the European tradition, that has, you know, people singing in harmony while growling or doing like the throat singing types of approaches, people singing in parts of the vocal range that wouldn't really fit into like the soprano, alto, tenor, bass scheme. And, you know, also a big motivating goal for me was like, I found singing in choirs really empowering when I was working on my voice, and, you know, working on changing my voice to have a sound that I was more comfortable with, you know, with regard to my gender identity. Mm-hmm. But it's not like necessarily a super easy prospect. If you want to go sing in a choir as like this empowering thing, and you can't sing the alto part because your voice is too deep, and they tell you to sing the tenor part, then suddenly like the style and the other people you're singing with have these like really kind of gendered assumptions built into it. So, you know, it's like you're singing, you know, maybe you're a trans woman and you can sing baritone, and you know, they're asking you to make your voice as deep and heavy and kind of masculine as you can, and that might not be a super comfortable experience. So I was able to sing alto, you know, kind of early on when working on my voice, and so that was really empowering. But if I hadn't been able to, I can just imagine this scenario of being like, oh, no, you have too much of a light sound. It sounds too feminine. We need it to sound more masculine here. You know, you're not blending with the men in the chorus. And so I had this goal of like, what if we wrote music that allows for, you know, all the women to be singing a really low part, or for, you know, some of the men to be singing a really high part, or whatever. Because there's all of these, like, unique vocal qualities we can obtain when we allow for those things to happen, and they just are so not, like, baked into the way that European choral music is traditionally written. And there are obviously choral composers who deviate from this kind of thing, and use really interesting textures. I remember reading something that was really kind of inspiring to me, which was in... Is it Rimsky-Korsakov, in Rimsky-Korsakov's Principles of Orchestration, where he said something like, the sopranos can be blended with the tenors, and the sopranos can be blended with the altos, but the altos should never be blended with the tenors, as an uncanny or unnerving sound may result. And I was just like, that line alone could inspire so many choral compositions, because it's like, well, don't we want uncanny and unnerving sometimes?
Why, yes.
You know, shouldn't we be exploring? Yeah, exactly. Like, and so it's like, so just blend the tenors with the altos, and you know, you'll see that done. I think Eric Whitaker does some of that, that kind of, you know, less traditional choral arrangement. But for the most part, a lot of modern choral arrangements are really following this tradition of kind of like this stack of voices, where like the deepest and heaviest voices have a certain role, and then, you know, the somewhat less deep, somewhat less heavy voices have a certain role, and it's all kind of in this scale. And, you know, we could have people with heavy voices singing up high. We could people with really light, you know, kind of soft or airy voices singing down low, but we tend to not explore those qualities.
It's almost like the gendered assumptions that are built into simple pitch height sort of come from expectations of timbre, perhaps. I'm sure it's more than that, but I mean, that's what strikes me immediately. And I'm also very interested in perhaps choral music that makes use of like androgynous vocal styles as well, where
absolutely
you can't quite tell if something is masculine or feminine. I mean, think about the text painting and the storytelling you could get out of that, and it's virtually untapped.
Right, absolutely. I'm so interested in that as well. And you know, it's so empowering for people who maybe don't fit into typical voice types. I mean, listen to both of us. I have like a really deep female voice, and you have a higher male voice, and
yeah,
the timbral qualities are so kind of independent from the pitch. And yet, like, if we were in typical choirs, it would be like, well, if you're singing low, you need to sing heavier. If you're singing high, you need to sing lighter. But we can get all these interesting combinations, like, if I'm way down low and I'm singing really soft, this isn't what you'd expect a baritone to sound like. If I go way up high and I'm singing with this really bright, brassy, belty quality, you know, and that wasn't super high. Way up high! But it's not the kind of qualities that we expect. I really love kind of defying those expectations. Like, yeah, where would someone want to sing if they didn't fit into a binary gender? I don't. I've had a really empowering experience of singing in choirs where I could sing multiple parts, and that was kind of a fun way to shake things up. Having, you know, one song where I sang bass and one song where I sang soprano, which that kind of plays into my name, my performer name, Erica Del Bassa, soprano sfogato. Like, all of these, like, Italian terms for, like, voice types are kind of silly, because they're describing, like, almost like a job description, you know? So, like, a soprano is really, like, not just someone with a high voice. It's someone who sings soprano in an opera or in a performance. But soprano sfogato is this kind of, like, almost disparaging term. I found this Wikipedia article, and it really encouraged me or inspired me. It said something like, a soprano sfogato is someone with a lower voice who sings soprano by effort, skill, or sheer force of will. And Whoa. So it's like someone who shouldn't be singing soprano. You know, it's like someone who the singing teacher would say, oh, no, you're an alto. Oh, no, you're a tenor. But they want to sing soprano. And so, I don't even really necessarily sing soprano all that often, but it's really like kind of my philosophy, I guess, is like, hey, I'm gonna sing whatever the hell I want. You know, I'm not gonna let like my physiology or the way people perceive my gender or anything like that dictate what I sing. And so, you know, that might mean working hard to sing the high notes, even though maybe someone is saying, hey, you can't sing those yet, or, you know, hey, someone else would be better suited for those.
Yeah.
And it also might mean singing the super low notes, even though, like, I'm up on stage in a dress.
All of these voice modifications also have, like, exciting implications for discovering, like, your own range and your own potential there. Like, how how masculine or feminine you
Absolutely.
can make yourself sound and what that means for your singing. I just think that's very exciting.
I think it's really exciting too. It's really something that's very fun to play with, and I haven't used it a ton yet, but I do have one composition in my album Love and Distance.
Yes.
Would You Love Me? That's very much, it's like a story of how I feel about my gender or my experience with gender, because there's this kind of sense when you realize you're transgender that maybe you could have transitioned earlier, maybe you could have done things differently to somehow have a body that better matches your identity, or to somehow have a voice, or a social role that better matches your identity. But at the same time, it's so difficult to think about that kind of thing, because like, if I could go back in time and change everything, I wouldn't be where I am now. We wouldn't be talking. I wouldn't have gone down this. I mean, maybe we would. Maybe this was a fated conversation, but I wouldn't have likely gone down the same. Maybe I wouldn't have likely gone down the same road. I wouldn't have. If I was. If I was assigned female at birth, I wouldn't have likely needed to change my voice to match my gender identity. So I might not have ever started singing. So I might not have started making music. I mean, it's all kind of entangled, because I was making music before I was singing, and I was singing before I was, playing with gender identity. But then I've sort of gotten so much more serious about those things because of this whole journey of like trying to learn more about the voice, trying to learn more what I can do with it. It's kind of just posing this question, like, if things had been totally different, would I still have the same connections to people? And one of the things I did in that song was I wanted to use playing with gender characteristics to sing most of the song in kind of my most comfortable range, which is more on the female side, and to sing part of the song in like as masculine as I could sing it, and to have kind of a transition between those qualities happen in the song. So it's almost like there's a little microcosm of my own gender transition happening within the song. So there's a line that goes, "When I think of me, change so much, would you know me? Would I even want you to? I know all of this is new. When I think of me, change so much, would you know me? Would I even want you to? I know all of this is new." And so it's kind of going from like a very, low range up into a higher range. And I'm honestly like still working on that song, because I want the male parts to sound more male and I want the female parts to sound more female. Even though like my own identity is somewhere in the middle, somewhere including kind of both and neither at the same time. And that's something I would love to see done more. I've only seen really a few examples of it, because a lot of people aren't necessarily comfortable bringing out both sides of both the male and female sides of their voice. Also, a lot of people haven't worked on those qualities enough to really kind of bring out that full range. But it's something I would love to see more in composition, because it's such a powerful storytelling tool. Mm-hmm. So this is something I definitely want to explore more in my music, and it's not something I've done a lot of, because I hold myself to higher standards than I can actually accomplish, and so I'm like constantly working to try and be able to get better recordings or whatever. So it's not something I've really explored as much as I want to, but I just love this idea that if I'm like telling a story through song, I can bring out these different qualities. I can have different kind of characters or different versions of myself present. That's also something I explored in one of the like storytelling tracks in my first album, Death and Odysseus, which is like a short poem or a short story, and it has a narrator but also a couple of characters, and it was really fun to just bring totally different voices to the different characters.
Said Love, and Death, with some solemnity, said to her,
"I am going to frighten Odysseus."
And drawing about him his grey traveller's cloak, went out through the windy door with his jowl turned earthwards. And he came soon to Ithaca, and the hall that Athene knew, and opened the door, and saw there famous Odysseus, with his white locks bending close over the fire, trying to warm his hands. And the wind through the open door blew bitterly on Odysseus. And death came up behind him and shouted. And Odysseus went on warming his pale hands.
Since you're doing so much voice work, I wanted to ask you if you think that understanding just intonation is essential to doing the sort of voice things you want to do.
I think it's helpful, but I don't think it's essential, and I can't really say that I understand it. I understand all this stuff about the voice because a lot of it is, like, can be really intuitive, and often we just need to think about, like, physical parameters that can be really continuously variable. So, like, the different gendered qualities of someone's voice can be, like, a really low pitch with a really high R1, or really high pitch with a really low R1, or whatever, and we can hear those qualities without having to think about, like, what just intoned chord they correspond to or whatever. I certainly think it can be helpful. I think you might get a slightly different answer from Zia if you ask her about this. I don't think she'd say it's necessary, though, because so many people understand voice modification who don't understand just intonation, and vice versa. One place I think it could be really, really promising is in thinking about writing choral music. And we've talked before about this. There's this idea in choral music that, like, people should blend in a specific way. And one of the aspects of that idea is that, like, everyone should be singing the same vowel. We have this idea that, like, when you're writing choral music, you can't have the tenors singing "oh" while the altos are singing "ah," because, somehow those will not line up or they won't sound good together. And, like, there's obviously some truth to that. If everyone's singing a totally different vowel, you can get this kind of crazy cacophony that's hard to interpret. But at the same time, when you think about the way that vowels work in different pitch ranges or with different gender characteristics, the alto singing "ah" is not the same as the tenor singing "ah." It's even if those vowels are the exact same vowel quality but they're at different pitches, then it's almost like you took a chord and you transpose the chord against itself, which is usually not how we think about harmonies. We usually aren't like, okay, I'm going to take the 7th chord and then I'm going to have the same 7th chord translated down a third or whatever. It's like, usually we would want to have, maybe a different voicing of the chord that fits in somehow. And so I really think there's a lot of, like, missed potential to think about, like, well, if the altos are singing, "ah," should the tenors be singing "ah" or something like that, but at a lower pitch? So we could have, like, an "ah," "ah," or an "oh," "oh," or something like that, and, like, what lines up better? Does it line up better if we have, like, an "oh, oh," or an "oh, oh"? And there's different possibilities there for how the vowel lines up that depend on the vocal tract lengths of the singers and the pitch range that they're operating in, and it's really complicated, so I'm not surprised that nobody has really, like, fully explored this as far as I'm aware, but it's also, like, the way that we teach it is, like, everyone sings the same vowel, and that's just kind of wrong. I know you've talked about composing a piece in IPA, which is probably one of the closest attempts that anyone has actually done to this kind of thing, because it's kind of the way you would need to think.
I'd love to get that done.
When we think about, like, choral blend or, like, perfect choral voicing, I think that's really the kind of thought that would have to happen to really perfect it, because, we tell ourselves that, like, everyone singing E is going to sound good, and then, like, in the next breath, it's like, oh, but sopranos, you need to do a darker E, because if you do a really bright E, it'll sound bad, and we don't want it to sound shrill, so, the sopranos, you should really be singing more like an eh, or something like that. And then, you start thinking about, like, well, why is that actually happening? And it's because the way that we perceive a vowel is, like, the which harmonics of a fundamental pitch are accentuated by the vocal tract. And so if we take, like, a vowel and we shift it down to a lower pitch, it really is like we're kind of taking that chord and we're shifting it. And I don't know, I guess it tends to line up decently well in practice, but it's also, like, there's this impression that you shouldn't ever be blending an O with an ah, or you shouldn't ever be blending an E with an oo or whatever, and like, I just don't think that's true. I think there's so much potential to explore those blends that actually is like, you know, forms a more complicated just-in-tone chord instead of just like doing the simple thing that we feel like we understand.
I think I understand what you are getting at. The idea is that since your voice rings with certain overtones when you sing certain vowels, those overtones are going to be subtly different throughout the range. So it's like, if you're singing like E here and you go down E, there's different material being accentuated, so if you transpose that high E down, you're getting like the same chord in like the wrong area of the voice.
Right, exactly. Yeah, like if you have... Right, if you transpose the exact same vowel, that's analogous to transposing a chord, like which set of overtones. And so if you have like, you know, a vowel that corresponds to, you know, a dominant seventh chord or something, and then you transpose it down by a third, that's like playing two dominant seventh chords transposed by a third, which, I mean, maybe that's what you want, but usually it's not how I think people are generally thinking of harmony.
It's getting pretty late over here. Would you be okay with calling
Yeah,
it?
it's been really fun talking to you.
Yeah, this has
Oh,
been
absolutely.
so
It's been
fantastic.
great talking to you.
Yes, thank you so much. We really appreciated hearing all about your music and about voice stuff. And this has been Soprano Sfogato, Erica Del Bassa. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
The song you just heard was the 7th track from Erica Del Bassa's album Love and Distance, titled Grave Clearing Ceremony. Thank you for listening to the podcast. We appreciate our listeners. If you want to help us out, please leave our podcast a review on iTunes and spread the word to your music theory-loving friends. We try to release new episodes every month on the 12th. Now and Zen is available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, or you can find our RSS feed at nowandzen.libsyn.com. We now have a Patreon account here at Now and Zen. Patreon is a site where you can make a small monthly donation in order to keep our show running. Your generous donations will go towards helping pay our editors, paying the fees to host more episodes online, bringing in special guests, and allowing time for a better quality of content. We also have additional conversations and bonus content for our top patrons only, that we continue to make the majority of our show free and accessible to everybody. When we hit the 40 patron mark, there will be another keyboard arrangement of an Easley Blackwood etude, the 16-note one. The 13-note keyboard arrangement is now on Stephen Weigel's YouTube channel if you want to hear/see it. Your support is appreciated more than ever during this difficult time. Remember, I need to have 60 patrons by December 1st, 2020 in order to continue the show as is. We've also planned out the rest of the year, yay. Our November 2020 episodes will feature Taylor Brook, Subrag Singh, and Methods Body in our bonus episode. The guests of the December 2020 episodes are a surprise for now. Our October bonus episode features more chatting with Paul Ehrlich about regular temperament theory from his paper, A Middle Path. This episode is made possible by the generous support of our patrons, our Xen Harmonic patrons, as well as our Xen Harmonic gods, Rabba Astor, Adam Fries, Matthew Sheeran, Vincenzo Sicarella, Hector McGuffin, Christopher Bailey, Leland O. Weigel, Amy Coleman, Joe Weigel, Tina Harmon Carto, and the Brass Whisperer. Thank you all so much for listening and thus supporting the show. Catch you next time on Now in Zen.